Well, a very warm welcome to this Education Policy Institute webinar on putting sustainability at the heart of education. This is the second event on sustainable education that we've held at EPI recently, and we're very grateful indeed to Apple for supporting these events. I'm David Laws, the chair of the Education Policy Institute, and I'll be chairing the discussion today. I'd like to say in a minute a little bit about the background to the discussion that we're going to have, EPI's interest, and sort of contextualize some of the discussion that we're going to have today. But I'm conscious that we have with us at the beginning of today's debate the Minister with responsibility for these areas, Baroness Barron from the Department for Education. We're delighted to have you with us here today, Minister. And you did warn us a moment ago that, as ever, there are some votes in the House of Lords which you may well be needed in. So I'm going to cut short some of my introductory comments, save those to after we lose you, and then take this opportunity to hear from you at the beginning of the session. And if we've got a moment to do so, to hear, to take a couple of the questions that may come in from the audience who are listening today. We're really delighted to have you here today, Baroness Barron. People often think that Lords ministers have less on their plate than Commons ministers as a consequence of not having constituents, but they forget that the Lords minister is usually one person dealing with everything from early years education through lifelong learning, whereas in the Commons, the ministers there get to divvy up the whole thing and they don't have to be experts in more than a small part of the portfolio. People also forget that the Lords ministers do a pretty serious job of leading on usually some of the heavyweight parts of the portfolio within their department. So we know that you've got a lot on your plate. We're delighted to have you here today, and I'm going to come straight to you to make your opening comments about government policy. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for those kind words. I think I'll use you for my PR on the role of a Lords Minister. Most people don't even know that Lords Ministers exist, let alone anything else. So thank you to you for inviting me. Thank you to the Education Policy Institute and to Apple for putting on this event. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk to you. And I was on a school visit this morning, and issues about the environment and sustainability are so uppermost in children and young people's minds. I think it is almost impossible to visit a school without talking about this subject. So of the things I'm responsible for, this is something that young people hold incredibly dear, which makes it a particular privilege. I'll do my best briefly to set out our plans and our strategy in this area. Obviously, in terms of the kind of legal context, we were the first major economy in the UK to enshrine net zero targets into law back in 2019, and we've committed to hit net carbon emissions by 2050. And we've also got our landmark Environment Act that was passed late last year, with the primary aim of halting the decline of nature by 2030, bringing in targets on biodiversity, air quality, water waste, and resource efficiency. And obviously, education plays an incredibly important part, both in delivering on emission reductions, on creating the economy that can be on a path to net zero, and in that transformation on how our attitude and our management of the natural world around us. And we're not going to achieve those targets, we think, without having some ambitious initiatives in education. And of course, critically, we are equipping a future workforce with the skills that they will need. And you will have seen our estimates of 440,000 green jobs being created, and a further 2 million more broadly as a result of these changes in the economy. And as I mentioned in my sort of opening reflection, children and young people are really worried about climate change, but they also are very motivated and enthusiastic to meet the challenges. And I'm lucky enough in DFE to have a group of young people who help advise us on these issues, and they are, as you would expect, super engaged and super knowledgeable. We launched our inaugural climate change and sustainability strategy at COP26. We worked closely with Italy and UNESCO as our partners, and I know that Vibeke was closely involved in this. There was a global forum at COP26, all as part of Education Day, that brought together education and environmental ministers for the very first time. So I think it helped to put education firmly on the map. It probably should have been there sooner, but it's firmly on the map now as part of the international climate dialogue. And the Secretary of State has set out a pretty holistic approach for our strategy, which looks at all the steps that we need to take, including action on education and skills that will deliver that transition to a low carbon future, as well as the action to transform the places in which people learn. So it looks at the education estate, the impact of our buildings and their grounds, and the opportunity to recultivate nature within them. And it also looks at the impact of supply chains in the daily operation of those buildings and the activities within them. And we plan to look across the whole education estate, from early years to higher and further education. So if we start with the learning bit, so sustainability is already a core component of what our children learn in school. In early years, there's topics around understanding the world, which children learn, but then the national curriculum provides a continuing framework, both through primary, where children look at seasons, habitats, weather patterns, but it also builds on all of that when we get to secondary education, including wider topics such as habitats of plants and animals, the water cycle, climate zones, vegetation belts, and in 2017, we introduced an environmental science A-level, which gives a particular opportunity for children who are especially interested in that area. As part of the new strategy, we think there's an opportunity to enhance the curriculum for primary schools, focusing particularly on nature, but also supporting teachers to feel really confident in the curriculum that they deliver. And that's something that I've heard, and I'm sure others in this session have heard young people talk about. They feel sometimes that their teachers are not as confident as they might be, and then that can detract from the quality of the education. So we're committed to giving teachers the best training and the best support that allows them to deliver the highest quality teaching. We've also funded the Oak National Academy during the pandemic, and Oak, some of you will know, has been providing remote education for pupils and support for teachers. And as part of that, Oak is developing resources around climate change and wider sustainability topics as part of the curricula that fits with our national curriculum subjects. We're also aware of the opportunities within further education. So teachers trained via an apprenticeship will be required to integrate sustainability into their teaching. And we're also working, obviously, with our higher education sector so that we can draw on the extraordinary resource in terms of their research and expertise as we shape our plans going forward. Then the second big plank of our strategy is around the school estate and the environment in which people learn. So we're going to be launching the National Education Nature Park. So that's initially a project which will bring together digitally the land across the education estate to promote the cultivation of the habitat, our natural habitat. But it will also equip young people in particular with a whole set of skills that will be extremely relevant beyond school. So in relation to geospatial mapping, measurement, plotting, all sorts of different skills, which will allow them not just to connect with nature, but to get and understand the biodiversity, not just of their school, but of others all around the country, but also a skill set that will be very relevant in the workplace beyond. And we also want to make sure that we have more energy efficient and resilient buildings on the school estate. So we've committed to ensuring that all new schools are built to net zero standards, and we're continuing all our programs to improve the quality of the school estate so that children and teachers benefit from being in a better environment. And then I just want to finish with sort of two wider points. I mean, at the risk of stating the absolutely blindingly obvious, technology is absolutely going to be more and more a part of the way that current children and future generations will learn and experience the world. And we've seen the vital contribution that made over the pandemic, both in terms of the ability to broaden and be more agile in terms of curriculum, but also the inclusivity that it's meant for certain pupils in particular who might be able to learn more easily in that way. Where I think we are keen to learn from all of you, and we'll be gathering data ourselves to make sure we get the best understanding, is the wider environmental impact of that use of technology and how we can maximize its positive impact and minimize any negative impact. And then the very last sort of reflection I wanted to share, which in a way I hope colleagues will take back to the young people who they work with and teach, is the message that I took away from COP26, which was really the level of enthusiasm and optimism and hope that employers had about the employment opportunities of the future. And I think we are all in this group painfully aware of what an incredibly difficult time children at every stage of their education have had over the last 2 years. But I sort of feel it's important to say that there is a really big light, positive light of opportunity at the end of this tunnel. We'll be doing everything we can to make sure that the curriculum and the environment and the skills we give children and young people is fit for that challenge. But I hope that you will help us seed that hope so that children feel confident in what the future holds for them and their part in being integral to the solutions we will discover. So thank you.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for those opening comments. I know you've got a limited amount of time, so we're just going to really put one big follow-up question to you. Obviously, this is a huge area, and there are lots of different aspects of it, as you've indicated in your comments. In terms of driving schools themselves to make a contribution to the net zero target and to be more sustainable, what sort of range of behaviours are you currently seeing in schools? I mean, is there quite a dispersion between best practice and people who are doing less because of they're having to focus on the pandemic? And do you see driving improvement in this area as being about promoting best practice, or should schools expect at some stage that there would be a greater degree of sort of measurement or pressure on them to try to help society to deliver on the net zero targets?
It's a very, very good questions. So I think in relation to the first part of your question, David, I think inevitably and completely understandably, the pandemic has kind of drowned out an awful lot of other activity. But having said that, as I reflected, most, if not all, of the schools that I have visited, and I visited lots happily in the last few months, there is a real energy at primary and at secondary to make this part of what the school cares about, what the school stands for. So I can't say that it's completely even, and I wouldn't be able to measure it, but I think we have a fantastic positive energy in students in the school. I'm not saying that teachers don't care about this too. I know many, if not most, do, but it's rather wonderful that there's something that we can all kind of align behind, and that is very much, if not entirely student-led, big aspects of it are energized by students. So I would say that in terms of best practice, there are already some reporting requirements, certainly on academy schools that I'm closer to, in relation to carbon emissions and so on. So I think, and obviously every school will need to abide by the law of the land. I think we're at a point of where we're trying to understand the most effective ways to deliver change, particularly in terms of the school estate, which I think is where your question is pointed. We've got the school rebuilding programme as an important part of that, but we're also exploring a number of other options where we hope we can get, the biggest environmental return on any financial investment. And again, as I mentioned, that's where we're keen to work with higher education, with business and others to understand how we can do that most effectively.
Minister, thank you very much for that. We know that you've got to leave now. We will be writing a paper summarising a lot of the discussion that we have today, and we'll make sure that we send a copy to your office so that you can look at the debate and the conclusions from it, even though you can't be with us for all of it today. But thank you so much for joining.
I appreciate it very much. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the session.
Thank you very much.
Then. Bye.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed for attending today. I cut short some of my opening comments just to allow the Minister to make her comments before leaving us. I was only going to say, by way of background, that most of us in education at the moment, whether you're school or college leaders, policymakers, research organisations, are, as the Minister mentioned, very focused on the here and now of the pandemic and everything that's been going on to try to manage schools and colleges over this period of time. And we're very active at EPI in a lot of our research in looking at the impacts of the pandemic. And making recommendations to policymakers and others about how some of those impacts on learning can be mitigated. And that's obviously incredibly important work. However, the temptation often for government, for organisations like ours, for school and college leaders, is to focus on the here and now, the immediate priorities, rather than thinking about threats and opportunities in the future. And I guess that was the same, prior to COVID arriving, governments and others were thinking about the here and now. Perhaps often a lot of the thinking and contingency planning for the future didn't look like something that was as urgent or needed to be taken quite so seriously as we now understand it does. And I think part of the lesson of COVID is that it does show us that it's not safe to plan on the assumption that the future will always look like the past, that sometimes really big and adverse developments can occur that require contingency planning and thinking forward. And in a way, therefore, COVID is a bit of a reminder that we need as a society to take more seriously the threats that could emerge in the future and not simply assume that they will disappear before our eyes and that things like global warming won't turn out to be the threat that it appears to be. So even at a time when we're thinking about managing the after effects of the pandemic, catching up on lost learning, dealing with mental health problems, we really need to be looking at these challenges that face the country. And the education system, is relevant to so many of these, because it's not just about how the education system itself greens itself as an estate. It's also about how it prepares young people for the challenges in the labour market and the opportunities that there will be in the green technologies. So thank you for joining us. We've got two debates that are now going to take place, and we've got some great panelists who have joined us with real frontline understanding and knowledge of the education system, of some of the wider policy challenges, but also what's going on in schools at the current time. So we're going to have these two debates now. The first panel discussion is about building sustainability in schools. So what does the 2050 target and some of the shorter term targets, what do these targets mean for schools in practice? Are we on track to meet some of those targets? What do schools need to do to engage seriously in this agenda? And what are the environmental implications of technology, and how do schools make choices using technology that are sustainable choices and that contribute to the net zero goals? That's the first panel discussion, and then the second panel will go on to look at issues around the curriculum. But to join us for the first panel today, we've got four outstanding speakers with that mixture of strategic knowledge of what's happening across education as a whole and frontline expertise from school groups that they're working within. I've asked the panelists to speak for about 3 to 5 minutes each by way of introduction, and then we will take some questions from those of you who are here with us today. Please do feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that very closely, and then when the four panelists have spoken, I will take some of the questions that have come from the chat and put that back to the panel with us today. So thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, I'm going to come to Steve Rollett, the Deputy CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Great to be here. And I just want to start by saying thank you to EPI for putting on absolutely your opening remarks there, David. I agree with you wholeheartedly. A really important discussion about looking at really what's coming down the line, because there is that risk, isn't there, at the moment, and quite rightly so, occupied with the here and now, but it is important we lift our eyes to the horizon, I think. So this is an important discussion. And I think I'd start by saying that there is a lot of good work already going on in our schools and trusts. We've got some colleagues who are going to speak, and they'll be able to speak much more, I think, about exactly that, what's going on in the ground in their schools and trusts. And inevitably, it is hard right now for schools and leaders of schools to do this, lifting their eyes to the horizon in terms of sustainability. But it is happening, I suppose, is the top message I want to deliver. We do have people that are doing this work. And I suppose the other thing I'd say as well, building on what Baroness Barron said a few moments ago, we've known, all of us that have worked in schools and had any contact with schools, colleagues on the call, we know that schools are crucibles of optimism and energy and really important specialised knowledge, actually, as well, which sort of feeds into the second panel discussion. And all those three things are going to be absolutely essential in how we as a society meet the challenge of sustainability in the coming years. So this is front and centre, actually, isn't it, for what we do in education. And I think the discussion that we're having here really brings together two important strands that are often spoken about quite separately, but we do need to increasingly, I think, try to talk to them together. And one of these is about the transformational work that we know is going on in schools and trusts in relation to digital technology. And of course, that was already happening before the pandemic, but there's no doubt about it that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated that work. And that's been well rehearsed, I think, in terms of the work that's gone on in schools and the ambitions that schools and trusts have got to further develop that stuff moving forward. And so increasingly, the schools and trusts that I work with are talking about the importance of their digital strategy. And that's absolutely right and proper. I'm sure lots of colleagues on the call are doing the same. But running alongside that, and this is what why today's conversation I think is so important is this growing awareness that this is unlike, I think, probably previous episodes we've been through in the school system where we've had drives for more or different use of technology, and we have lived through some of those periods before. I think partly because it's more purposeful, because of what we've seen as a result of COVID-19. I think we've got more sort of demonstrably clear use cases for that technology than we've had before. So I think it's arguably more targeted work that's going on, but also, of course, this link with sustainability and the net zero ambition. And I think the challenge for us is to see these things as a sort of a double helix rather than seeing them pulling in unhelpfully different directions. And what I would point to, three things I think that probably we ought to be thinking about. First of these is about lifespan. So trying to make sure the choices we're making moving forwards about technology, and this is about procurement, a lot of what I'm talking about here, that we're picking the devices that we think are going to live with us the longest, but really we've got an eye on the circular economy as well, and we're thinking about not just what are we going to do with them immediately, but what these devices, what uses might they be put to sort of down the line by us, by our wider trust, or indeed elsewhere in the community. Having an eye on that from the start. Second thing is about services. We know that a huge amount of the environmental impact is not in the use of the devices, it's in the manufacture of them, and also what's going on. So a lot of people quite rightly moving to cloud approaches and all that sort of stuff. But are we asking the important questions about carbon mitigations and all that sort of stuff? That's the second thing. And the third thing I want to mention is energy use. And again, lots of good work going on about that. But are we using renewable energy? And again, the services that we're buying in, are they using renewable energy as well? Three things there, practical things that I think hopefully we should be thinking and talking about as part of our digital strategies. I hope that's useful to get us running, David.
Steve, that was great. You covered a hell of a lot of territory in a very concise and disciplined way. So thank you very much for that. There are lots of issues you've raised that I want to come back to in the questions, but thank you for kicking us off so well. I'm now going to come to Emma Knight. Emma, as most of you will know, is Chief Executive of the National Governance Association. The NGA has been looking at this whole issue of sustainability in schools recently. It's absolutely their territory and something that's going to be incredibly important for school governing bodies. So Emma, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much to EPI for putting this on. It is absolutely an important discussion, as the Minister and you have said, and I just want to bring that conversation back to your title about putting sustainability at the heart of education. Well, NGA would say this, wouldn't we? But it's absolutely right that if you really want to get environmental sustainability threaded through your trust or your school, you need to do that by putting it into your strategy. So the governing board absolutely has to decide that this is going to be a priority. Otherwise, you can do lots of good work doing little bits of projects here and there that you might start off in a sort of random fashion because various people are passionate about different things. But in order to really tackle this issue in the way that we really need to, we've got to look at it in a whole trust or whole school approach. So you're right, NGA launched a campaign which we did called Greener Governance, which we did during COP26, and probably partly because of that timing, it is our biggest campaign to date in terms of how much take up and how much downloading of the resources. So I won't go through our guidance and all the elements of that campaign, but we have produced updated guidance for boards on how to start with a whole school or trust approach. And we have adopted from the National Association of Environmental Education their 4 C's approach. So that's looking at culture, looking at community, campus, that's a bit of a cheat because we wanted it to be a C, but estates and premises, and then lastly curriculum. And what that guidance does is give boards a starting point in terms of questions under each of those elements. And what we're going to do for April is a third edition of the guidance, which takes each of those topics a little bit further. So you inviting me to today is going to make us think about ed tech, because it barely gets a mention at all. So I'll absolutely be taking notes and following up that that idea. But I just wanted to very quickly in the time now just point out the fact that one of the things we're asking boards to do is adopt a greener governance pledge, and that has 3 parts: reducing carbon, putting sustainability on the agenda, so literally, and then thirdly, ensuring that a climate action plan does deliver change. And obviously you'll have seen, I'm sure, that in the department's draft strategy, they're using that phrase, climate action plan. And we're, in order to improve the resources that we put out, we're conducting at the moment a number of conversations with our members, both from trusts and single schools. So I thought it might just be useful to report very quickly some of the issues people are already bringing up with us. The very first one the Minister talked about passionately, so I won't dwell on, but the fact that a lot of this is led by pupil voice. The governing boards that have been early adopters have often been because their pupils push the agenda, and there's more we could say on that. But the second issue is about ensuring the capacity and the capability of leadership and indeed other staff, because many of you have mentioned already there's a lot going on in the world of education, and the board's main role is really to make sure that people have the time and wherewithal to take this on. And I can we may come back to that more in the discussion. But for example, one of the single academy trusts that was talking to us has done lots of good work. They've actually got a director of sustainability on their senior leadership team. They've been at it for really quite a long time and developed staff up to that point. But I think it's a really important notion if we are going to be able to deliver at the pace and with the expertise that is required. The third point is actually one of your questions, really, which is how do you monitor all of this? I mean, that's the big question boards are saying. Well, this is lovely, Emma. We're completely with you. We want to do this, but how on earth do we know if we're making progress? We don't want to set our staff monitoring all sorts of stuff, which adds to their workload, but doesn't make a difference. And I think it's fair to say, and even though I'm on the record, I'm going to say this, I think there isn't as much known about that as we would all like to. So we have been really thrilled by the number of green partners and experts that have come to us and offered expertise and information. But actually, in terms of what we need in the school sector to take a holistic view, we're all learning together, I think is the way forward. And then the very last point is we're great fans, actually, of the DFE's draft strategy, but there is one big omission, and that is about resources in terms of money, as well as people I've already mentioned, but particularly around buildings. There are some trust and school business leaders out there doing fabulous work, actually, on really technical stuff. But actually what they're saying to us, or boards are reporting to us, is, do you know what? We've done what we can with no budget, really. And now what we want to do, for example, is install a ground pump. Is it called heat source pump? But we can't afford to do that. Where do we go for that money? And we really do need the government, if they're serious on this, to come up with a little bit more. There's more I could say, but I feel I ought to stop there, David, and let other people join in too. Thank you.
Emma, that was great. Again, you covered a lot of territory, and I've got quite a few things I'd like to come back to on there, including some of the questions that are coming in from the audience who are listening. But before we do that, I'm going to come to Dawn Hayward, our third panelist. Dawn, we're delighted to have you with us today, Chief Executive of the Windor Academy Trust. As we've already discussed, an awful lot going on in the school and college system at the moment. So we're very grateful to senior leaders who've given up time to be part of the call, both as panelists and listening in. Dawn, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this really important debate and discussion. I have the huge privilege of being the CEO of the Windor Academy Trust family, a family that serves 7,000 children, has 1,000 staff across 9 primary and secondary academies across the West Midlands. And as a family, we have a deep commitment to the 2 themes of the discussion tonight, a deep commitment to both sustainability and the important role that digital technology plays within sustainability. And there were 3 things that I really wanted to talk about this evening and humbly share. The first is why are we so committed to sustainability and the role of digital technology? The second is then very, I guess, humbly and pragmatically sharing a little around how we are going about reaching the net zero target. For us, that's by 2030, not 2050. And then finally, I'll say a little around the role of digital technology and the important role that plays. So first of all, why? Why does this matter? Well, I think the pandemic has made us question many things. It's stopped us in our tracks and it's made us think. And as the world emerged stronger from the pandemic, I really believe we have a golden moment in time, an opportunity to rethink education. I've had the real privilege of meeting Valerie Hannon, who has worked with the DfE Education Innovation Unit, and also is a senior advisor to the OECD Education 2030 project, and I've read her book, Thrive. And this has really inspired me to reimagine education for the Watt family, and through our school trust strategy, which we've called Powering into the Second Decade, really think about what the future of education looks like and the important role that sustainability and digital technology play within it. And we know that children in schools flourish and are interdependent with the communities and the planet flourishing. You can't separate those things out. And I believe we're at an inflection point, and it's time for us as educators to be brave and to redefine the purpose of education and to bend the curve of educational progression. So let me kind of move a little bit on to our strategy. As a family, in our strategy, we're making 5 big moves. One of those big moves is focused on sustainability and becoming a net zero by 2030. An enabler of all of our big moves is digital technology. That includes sustainability, but it's broader than that. It supports all of our 5 big moves. So, you know, I humbly don't profess to know how to do all of this. All I can do is share how we've tried to address this and how we've thought about simplifying this, because it can feel a little overwhelming. So our sustainability big move is structured around the 10 One Planet Living principles, and this provides a framework for us to plan and undertake action. These are really closely aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed the 5 areas that are set out in the DfE's draft sustainability and climate change strategy. And within this, there are kind of 4 areas, I suppose. The first is we need to know where we are. We need to be data driven. We need to know what our CO2 emissions are, how much energy we're contributing to the national grid through solar panels and so on and so forth. So we've learned quite closely from business. We've been working with the Chamber of Commerce, and we've been got into partnership with an organisation called EO, who are helping us to develop an energy dashboard that operates at both the school trust level, a school level, and indeed goes down to a child level. So the child will be able on their one-to-one iPads to track the impact that they are having on the environment. So that's absolutely critical for us. The second area is around how we're planning against the One Planet Living principles. So what we've done is we've broken those down. We've looked at what we're doing already. We've spoken to all of the head teachers and senior leaders across the trust, and we've asked them simply to weave into their school improvement plans the actions that they will take in a very intentional way to move towards enacting those 10 One Planet Living principles. Clearly, the third area is around hearts and minds. And for me, this is, you know, it's been mentioned previously by Steve, that this is not another thing to do. This is part of everything that we do. This should be omnipresent and part of our culture. And we're very intentional about that. And that means mobilising everybody. Our students, of other colleagues have spoken about, and Baroness Barron, absolutely. Our students care deeply about this. So our student senators have led this through our Student Senate Summit. They've developed, from their perspective, they've led things from a student perspective. They've led a COP26. They run eco clubs, forest schools, they plant trees. I've got funding from the Woodland Trust to plant trees across our estates and within our community. They run recycling programs, they make sure the lights are switched off. They've got different approaches to walking, cycling or scooting to school. They've looked at the menus within our schools and looked towards vegan and vegetarian diets within their schools. They've ensured we've got limiters on our water stations. They even do things like Christmas toy exchange and clothes exchange and contributions to food banks. Our staff have been really critical, been looking at things like car sharing, changing the way our staff are travelling to work. We are changing the way in which our staff are learning, particularly through the use of digital technology rather than face-to-face professional learning, how we're using digital technology to support remote learning as well. And indeed, our staff are working collaboratively to ensure that things are built within the curriculum. And that also means working with business to look at how we're preparing our young people for green roles and green industries and green jobs. And really importantly, we're working really closely on the civic agenda. That's a different one of our big moves, combining civic and sustainability, big moves together. How can we work with our communities? And our children are working with local parish councils, working with the community to undertake sustainability within their communities. And the other area that we are really doing quite a lot of work on is around the school estate. We've been very lucky and well supported by the Department for Education through the public sector decarbonisation scheme. We've received £2.5 million from them for the first two stages of that. That has led us to install solar panels, double glazing, LED lighting, energy management systems in 5 out of our 9 schools. We know it's reduced our energy bills by 50% so far within the first 6 months. It's reduced our CO2 emissions by 275 tonnes a year, and we're contributing over 600,000 kilowatts to the national grid. So those are, critical steps that we are taking. And finally, digital technology is critical within this. I won't say too much on this because I know Rob will talk about that in a moment. I know Rob well, and he's doing an amazing job at Oasis. But we have made a strategic decision to move towards one-to-one iPads for our young people. And we're already seeing the massive impact that's having on things like reduction in photocopying, reduction in textbooks, enhancing the way that young people are learning broadly, but clearly about sustainability as well. And I'll finish with a quote from Sir David Attenborough, and it kind of takes me back to where I started. This is deeply important. And he talks about, we are at a unique stage in our history. Never before we've had such awareness of what we're doing to our planet, and never before have we had the power to do something about that. And just because we are not measured yet on the role we're playing around sustainability does not mean it's not the right thing to do.
Dawn, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And again, you crammed an immense amount of information into a very small slot of time. I'm definitely going to come back to ask you later on about how you're going to share further some of what you're doing, which sounds great. I'm also going to ask Steve and Emma how typical that is of what schools are doing, or whether you are an extreme outlier, and how we're going to connect the best with those who are perhaps lagging a bit further behind. But first, as Dawn mentioned, I want to come to Rob Lamont, who, again, we're very grateful to have with us here today, the Director of Information Technology at Oasis Community Learning. Rob, thanks.
Thank you, David. And it's great to be part of such an important conversation, and to hear the passion and the detail that everyone else is speaking around this topic. I think probably the most contribution I can make to this conversation is really to talk about what we've learnt in Oasis Community Learning about the technology choices that we've made, and about making them both environmentally and financially sustainable. When we started to think about digital learning and our strategy, it was quickly apparent that finding a way to give every one of our 32,000 children from reception to year 13 an iPad that they could use at home would be key to making it a reality. And our CEO, John Murphy, set out a vision for the Trust, which included digital learning for every student, even before COVID-19 became a thing that we were also familiar with. But we knew that if this was ever going to be achieved, we had to provide it in a way that didn't involve asking our parents to contribute. And this whole vision kind of spoke really to the heart of our core values and mission about offering equality of access to digital technology with peers, regardless of their context. So financial sustainability really became a massive part of how we were going to make that vision possible. But what really became apparent very quickly was, at least in part, that was inextricably linked to environmental sustainability as well. Oasis Horizons, which is what our digital technology program became known as, financial sustainability came from savings in our day-to-day operations and ways of working. The changes that the project facilitated allowed us to find those savings rather than trying to make cuts that were perhaps detrimental in other areas of our work. So Oasis Horizons underpins the Oasis curriculum in what we do. It's a fundamental part of our strategy for learning, and the use of standard apps and was designed really to support the curriculum and has allowed us to invest significant amounts of time in CPD, which in turn allows teachers across the organisation to take advantage of the tools they provided with. The easiest and obvious change in behaviour that we saw, and Dawn kind of alluded to this at Windsor as well, was printing and the volumes of printing that we saw across the trust. Giving every teacher and every student an iPad fundamentally changes the way that they can share work and interact together, and the ability to share information electronically requires, you know, the development of skills and practice that I referred to in that CPD. But so far in this academic year, without actually campaigning or a dedicated drive around it, compared to kind of pre-Oasis Horizons levels, we've saved 240 trees in paper, we've reduced the energy used, which is the equivalent to over 300 fridges, and the CO2 equivalent to running 16.5 cars. And all that's through that kind of natural change that's come about in the ways of working that are going on. And at the same time, that's diverted £250,000 into supporting the financial sustainability of our project as well. Giving every student their own iPad has fundamentally shifted the amount of IT equipment and the types of IT equipment we have in our schools. So I think it's safe to say in the education sector, there's been a tendency to fund and manage our technology choices through periodic injections of capital, whereas through grants or projects or other initiatives that have come along, rather than considering perhaps the whole life cost of technology choices that people make. We're now at a point where our academy leaders across the Oasis family have said they no longer need a lot of the shared equipment that they previously had. So we've reduced the number of shared laptops down from over 9,000 to 600, and our student shared desktops from around 8,500 down to under 2,200. And taking into account the true life cycle cost, this reshaping of our estate has immediately generated significant annual financial savings, which have amounted to over half the total annual cost of making Oasis Horizons a reality. But at the same time, whilst giving every student an iPad has increased the number of devices in our estate, the energy consumption has been reduced by around 500,000 kilowatt hours per year, and something in the region of 90,000 kilograms of CO2 production as well. Access to iPads at home and at school has meant migrating to cloud storage for staff and students. It's been vital. Migrating to Microsoft OneDrive to replace our home directories and SharePoint Online in place of shared drives has meant that, you know, our need for on-premise storage and servers has been reduced, and it's brought a whole load of functionality benefits as well. A big cost saving has come from actually changing the way we back up and protect our data, from reducing the amount of files stored on our servers that in turn needed to be backed up off-site and within associated storage infrastructure, etc. We now, yes, do have to pay for backing up our cloud-based files, but we predict that this shift alone is just going to save us in the region of around £100,000 a year. The number and capacity and performance of our server needs has reduced with the transition to the cloud, and as well as being less hardware to replace and less energy being consumed directly, it reduces the need for things like air conditioning and other supporting infrastructure. I mean, I could go on talking about these various different elements, but in the interests of time and in summary, I think to answer kind of questions about making digital technology both financially and environmentally sustainable, our experience in Oasis Community Learning is the importance of thinking holistically, thinking about what fundamental changes to the way of working that digital technology facilitates, what it allows us to stop, as well as what it allows us to start. And our experience is both environmental and financial sustainability can go hand in hand, and it's perfectly possible to construct a sustainable program that brings about the benefits of technology in a sustainable way. Thank you, David.
Thanks to all four of the panelists. You've given me a difficult job to do as chair, because you've raised so many extremely interesting issues, and we've now got 9 minutes left for the end of this particular session. We've also had some really interesting questions and challenges come up in the chat. So what I'm now going to do is go back to each one of you, if it's okay, and I'm probably going to pick up, a particular issue that arose out of your comments, but feel free also, if there are things that are occurring in the chat that I haven't covered that you want to cover, to quickly respond to those. However, I need to highlight for all of you in this session that we've only sort of got 8 or 9 minutes left. So could you do a little bit of self-policing so that we don't eat into your colleagues' time? But Steve, I was going to come to you first. 2 sort of questions. I mean, one is there anything you're doing at CST to get out to the system as a whole information about exemplars? Who are the schools that are doing the amazing things like Dawn, that other schools can look to rather than having to reinvent the wheel? And somebody asked, is there a kind of ranked list of things that schools can do with the biggest impact? Now, that will obviously vary by school depending upon buildings and everything else, but do you want to touch on those and briefly on anything else that you saw that came up?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll try and be as quick as I can. So in terms of what we're doing at CST, it's a great question, and I'll be honest, as part of my preparation for this today, it's certainly given me cause to reflect on it. So one of the things that we know is that, of course, that mantra where, start with something small, do something yourself, just do something. Definitely, yes, great. But the other thing we know as well is if we're all making small changes, that's fine. But the aggregate effect of that may not be as important as if we get key players to make some quite small changes. Okay, so for example, picking up that point I was making earlier about like services, like cloud providers of cloud services and the like. Well, arguably, if they can make sure that they are putting in place, mitigations, making sure they're as efficient as they can be in environmental terms and so on, and you think of the biggest companies and often schools and trusts that are tapping into that stuff. Well, the effect of that and those small changes that those big providers can make can add up to, frankly, a bigger picture than we might with some of the small stuff. And that's not saying we shouldn't do the smaller stuff, but coming back to what do we do at CST? Well, we work with a range of partners. And actually, it's sort of a note to myself, really, that actually we probably need to do some more work, actually, not just talking to our trusts about what they're doing, but actually also talking to people who work to support the education sector to say, so what are you doing? And of course, as I talked about earlier, we're working with our trusts to think more carefully about digital strategy and how sustainability fits within that. We've got CFO networks, COO networks who are looking at these sorts of issues, but certainly we can do more. So I suppose a pledge here today to answer your question, we're going to try and do more on that. Three things I just quickly want to mention. So one of them is about investment, and I absolutely agree with Emma. A lot of this stuff doesn't come for free, so we do need to make sure that government ambition is matched with the right funding. Of course we do, but I'd also say this as well, which is, and talking specifically to to multi-academy trusts here, what we know is as trusts grow, often one of the benefits of that is then some more central capacity that then can be deployed and spent on these sorts of issues. So I think some of what we've heard about from Dawn today and Rob today is sort of comes out of that dynamic. The second thing I'd say as well is about knowledge building, and this is something that CST is saying to our trust members, is actually the thing that you do. Yes, you've got the financial efficiencies and capacities and that sort of stuff I've just mentioned, but really importantly, you also have that specialist knowledge that you can then deploy quickly and effectively across a range of organisations. And so we think there's a key role, frankly, for trusts to play on this issue as knowledge building institutions, doing exactly what Dawn and Rob have done today, growing that knowledge within their trust, and then helping us all to benefit from it. But I'll stop there so others can comment.
Steve, thank you very much. Dawn, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, it was such a fascinating discussion. Are you planning, other than what you've said to us today, are you and other schools that are leading in this area planning to publish the detail of what you're doing so that other schools can nick your best ideas? And somebody did raise in the chat the question of, you know, are there any downsides for students of measuring carbon, particularly at a student level? I mean, does it create worry or mental health type concerns about students who are sort of over monitoring what they're doing? Are there any negatives to getting students really actively involved in this themselves?
So thanks, David. Let me take the first one. Yes, we've already written a number of things to share, both within the education sector. We've done some work with Schools Week on a couple of pieces, and we've also been working with the business sector, particularly through the Chamber of Commerce. So there have been a number of places that we've been sharing, and happy indeed if it's helpful to do more of that. Secondly, from a student perspective, I think that it's a really interesting perspective actually to see whether it actually causes more anxiety. I suppose the way that we're looking at it is more of if 7,000 children and 1,000 staff all take individual action, then it moves things forwards. The thing that everybody can be responsible for are their own individual actions. And I think that's the purpose behind it, to make young people aware of the actions they're taking and the impact that it has. And actually, the aim is that it's a positive thing, that they can see the contribution that they are making. So that's the intention of it. It's certainly not designed in any way to make children worry or anxious, but just to, you know, we can all take action. And if we all take action, what a massive difference we can make.
Thank you, Dawn. Rob, a lot of questions coming up about how schools should make decisions about the technology that they use. How do they know that it's the most sustainable? How do they know about the implications of, you know, impacts of different ways of manufacturing, lifespan, and so forth? That's very difficult for individual schools, particularly smaller schools, to evaluate. How do schools make rational decisions on digital technology and other devices? How do they make sure that they're actually choosing genuinely the most sustainable solution?
I think it's a really difficult area for a lot of schools, and I think, again, speaking to our kind of experience, really, when we were going into sort of making these big investments, these big choices, it took quite a lot of research. There's a lot of things that are actually published, but there's quite a lot of kind of you have to dig through quite a lot of the information. You have to interpret quite a lot of the information, and it requires quite a lot of expertise to be able to do it. So it's quite challenging for schools. I think what we found, and I think our kind of wider strategy in the trust really, is about building the obligation into our procurement mechanisms and our procurement framework. So effectively putting the onus on the suppliers, on the supply chain, to actually demonstrate how it is meeting targets, how it's reducing the amount of emissions, the amount of energy consumption, how it's dealing with things like waste management, and making sure that the full kind of life cycle of the devices is being considered. So, you know, they're being recycled, what's actually happening to the components, you know, they're not ending up just in a kind of you know, a landfill or anything like that, but they are genuinely being recycled, and actually, you know, making that part of the selection and the criteria on which those choices are made.
Great. Rob, thank you very much indeed. And Emma, I'm just going to come to you last. I mean, we heard that very encouraging record from Dawn of everything that's going on in her school. Give us, without putting any of your members in trouble, you know, how much is that an outlier? And would you care to sort of even guess roughly at how many schools are really, you know, well advanced in this versus sort of in the middle versus nowhere? And then we had a question from Andrew Reed. Do we know of any schools that are generating a significant part of their energy from renewable resources? I don't know whether that's something that you've already picked up, but if you could briefly touch on those two, please.
Yeah, sure. I've absolutely seen the work that Windor Academy Trust are doing, and it is great. And I would say it is an outlier. Because we do a big annual governance survey, we did ask the question in 2020 about who had started to look at environmental sustainability, and we were quite impressed at that point. It was just over 40%, not quite half, but since really doing much more in-depth work over the last 6 months, we think that was a little bit of an optimistic figure, that actually most people have just begun really thinking about this. And I think it builds on the point other people and Rob were just saying, is actually, if you're going to do it well, you do have to research, you do need knowledge, you do need some expertise, which sort of goes back to that point about we do need to make sure that leaders are equipped to do that. So we're absolutely in the business of sharing examples from one trust to another and one school to another, but it's not, it really isn't going to be the whole answer. But I was just going to put in the chat later, I know there's a conference going on in the Northwest next term on this topic. So if any of your folk are from the Northwest, you might know about it or want to join in. That point about how you decide what is the most important. What we found is that there are so many really passionate people about part of the agenda. There's some fabulous projects going on about climate in the curriculum, which is being led by a professor of meteorology who's also a chair of primary school governors. But I commend that as a great piece of work, or people working on air pollution or travel to school or energy. But how, if you're first starting this, you go, well, our time and effort and money will be better spent on X or Y, is incredibly hard, and we all need to develop that. But I was really interested in listening to Dawn that she mentioned food, because actually if you look at some of the changes that make big differences to the environment, what we eat is a big one, and we all know that can be quite controversial in schools. So that's something we want to write a little bit more on. So I'll be interested to hear people who have tackled that and moved their menus to a vegetarian or vegan menu. So there is so much more we do need to share, join up, but also I do think lobby. We're not really going to be able to do this in the way I think many of us on this call want to, unless the government sort of keep it really up at the top of their agenda as well.
Emma, that's great. We covered an awful lot of territory in quite a short period of time. We will be thinking at EPI after this event how we follow up some of the really important issues that are coming up today. We'll also be publishing a summary of some of the discussion, and we'll provide in that links for people who miss some of the things that have been discussed today but want to follow up on them, and we'll put that on the EPI website. But I'm now going to move on to the second and final discussion today. We've got about just under half an hour for this, but this is the also crucial issue of how we embed climate education in the curriculum. So how can schools and colleges effectively embed climate education in the curriculum? What opportunities does technology offer to enable this? And what role can data play in improving climate education, and how can technology support this? So we've got, again, 3 fantastic speakers to cover this area. I'm going to come first to Steve Frampton, the president of the Association of Colleges. Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, David. And yeah, I'm currently the FEHE Climate Commissioner. 108 years in the making. First time we've worked together, back time too, isn't it, really, on something this important. So we tried to help the sector by producing an action plan, a roadmap that they could sign up to, a direction of travel, gave them a pathway to act. And we subsequently produced the Green Commitment, which outlines its linkage with the Green Skills Agenda, which I think is critical, and also a new code of governance, because I couldn't agree more with the panel so far. Governance and leadership are key drivers. So that was to try and help our 240 colleges. Let's remember, 2 million students in the sector, actually more 16 to 18 in college sector than in schools. So perhaps just 5 things needs beyond culture, if you like. Firstly, estates. Couldn't agree more. And there are great examples already. If you go over to Northern Ireland and go to Southwest College and look at their N campus, they've got passive house premium there, but it costs 30 million. So that really links to the point that people were saying, unless we're going to get real government investment in this, we're not going to get the sorts of buildings, let alone retrofitted buildings, that we're going to need. And we think it's going to cost another 1.5 billion on top of the amount that the government have put in already. But those buildings can then act as fantastic teaching resources for the students and learners, and it's a missed opportunity. You're right. The second thing is it's all around data. We need better measuring and reporting tools, not just the ones that we've got. And colleges, like schools, don't have the time, the expertise and the money, but they do need to be co-constructed with the sector, not imposed on them, to be really useful. So I think that's absolutely critical. And it's got to move from focus on scope 1 and 2 to the difficult stuff on scope 3, and I'll come back to that later. It's all around curriculum, though, David, as the team's already pointed out. There is a baseline curriculum already called the Carbon Literacy Project, available for 8 to 10 hours. Currently, BAYS and DFE are having their own staff do it. So obviously it's viable and it's useful, but it's got to go to all boards, all quals, all levels, every pathway, academic and vocational, from centre level 5, because every student's got an entitlement to have this, like is currently happening in Italy. And I think it's got to be best informed with knowledge exchange with the higher education sector. And that leads me on to, whatever we do, let's co-construct it with young people. It's not an agenda that we do for them or to them, it's what we do with them, and hopefully in the best ways forward, when they own the agenda and make us accountable for progress, really. Otherwise, not surprisingly, we get the 20% levels of eco-anxiety, where young people feel that we're not doing as much as they think we ought to. I think we shouldn't underestimate the massive opportunity for the green skills agenda as an optimistic, hopeful agenda, which enables activity in this space. But it's going to need a really good green careers service to enable young people to access those 1.2 million jobs that are going to be there by 2030. And as Bill Gates says, every job will have to be green by 2050, and every institution will, otherwise they won't survive. So what I think I would finish by summarising is, for me, this is a collaborative agenda and a co-constructed agenda, and curriculum's at the heart of it. We ought to be doing this with FE, with HE, but also FE with our schools. Big shout out for what Alex and Ashdown are doing at Net Zero. We've been working with them. It's an agenda we need to work on together. This isn't a league table. We all need to succeed. And we ought to be working collaboratively with all partners, LAs, LEPs, everybody we can, really, in order to make the progress that we need. Because as Gates said, it's going to make the pandemic look easy, easy, easy. And we're going to be required to work holistically, collaboratively, at scale and pace. And I don't mean on the little things, really. We've mentioned recycling, we've mentioned lights, we've mentioned plastics and food in the canteen. But let's get stuck into the difficult stuff that Rob was hinting, really. We've got to look at procurement, we've got to look at scope 3, we've got to look at transport policies, and we've got to look at what finance is doing, our pensions, etc., because that's 21 times as significant as all the others. So we've got to get stuck into some difficult stuff as well, I think. And in terms of sharing, we organise an annual conference on March the 23rd for AOC members, but it's open up to all, and you'd all be very welcome. The point of the conference is, let's share the best practice. Let's get everybody together in a room, and we've got 39 colleges sharing the expertise that they've got, like Southwest College in Northern Ireland are going to share their Passive House Premium project, like South Devon College are going to use their embedding of the SDGs in their curriculum, and have been doing it for 10 years, because it's all around sharing so we don't reinvent the wheel. Tried to cover it very quickly, David, because I know time's at the premium.
Steve, you've done a great job, and you've covered, like other panelists, a lot of territory. So thank you very much for that. We'll come back to some of those points. And congratulations on your role as the FEHE Climate Commissioner. Good that we've got one, but as you said, also nice to see something that's working across those two sectors that sometimes are a bit siloed. So I think we're all quite encouraged by that. Our second speaker on this panel is Rebecca Jensen, who is the Director for the Division for Peace and Sustainable Development at UNESCO. Rebecca, we're really delighted to have you join us here today. Thank you for being so patient as we have had the other earlier panel discussions today. Very interested to hear from you now.
Thank you so much, David. And I have to say, I have really enjoyed myself over the past hour. Thank you for inviting UNESCO to take part in this very, very interesting conversation. And I think I've heard some really inspirational things actually from the other panelists. So thank you so much for that. I guess my role this afternoon is to share a little bit what is happening at the global level and how we are working from UNESCO's side with really addressing climate change and education for sustainable development with our member states. Now, last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a landmark report that really confirmed that the impacts of climate change are widespread, rapidly intensifying at previously unforeseen rates. At the same time, UNESCO issued a report that found that only half of the curricula, education policy frameworks and curricular frameworks of about 100 countries actually mention climate change. So to effectively address the interconnected global issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and also increased pollution, we need to embed the concept of sustainability in all levels of our education systems across the curriculum with the whole school approach. In UNESCO, we like to talk about education for sustainable development, ESD, as something that empowers learners with the knowledge, the skills, the values, and attitudes to take informed decisions and make responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability, and also a just society. Now, in May last year, UNESCO launched the ESD, Education for Sustainable Development framework for 2030 and accompanied by a roadmap. And this happened and was endorsed by the participants at the World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development that was made out of Berlin, but was a virtual conference. Now, the ESD for 2030 framework and roadmap really provides a blueprint for governments and also education stakeholders, civil society, and learners of all ages to reorient the goals of learning for the purpose of societal transformation in the direction of sustainability. And the goal is to include content on sustainability in curricula all over the world at all levels. We need to ensure education helps learners not only gain the knowledge, but also the skills and the competences, as well as the values and agency to contribute to a better world. And so within the ESD for 2030 framework, we very much promote the transformation of whole schools so students can live what they learn and schools are contributing to a greener community. It promotes the use of new technologies to find ways to engage a new generation of students in sustainability. And also systematic monitoring is central to this framework. Data is crucial to strategically steer actions undertaken and also to monitor progress. And other speakers have already spoken to that. Now, there is a great support for our vision of the transformation of education, and to mention just a few things that indicate this. In the World Conference in Berlin last May, we had some 2,800 education and environment stakeholders participating, and they came from 161 countries, and including some more than 70 ministers and vice ministers, who really backed the adoption of the Berlin Declaration on Education for Sustainable Development. And also, as the Baroness kindly mentioned, in November last year, for the first time, we had climate education taking a center stage at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. Education and environment ministers jointly pledging to embed climate change into their education systems. And we were very pleased to work with the UK and the Italian governments on this particular event. Likewise, UNESCO member states in our general conference that took place in November last year, UNESCO, they all agreed or committed to greening every curriculum and every school by 2025. Now, to achieve this, governments must, of course, act upon their commitments through education initiatives in their own countries, and commit also to climate education at the COP27 in Egypt in half a year's time. We very much in UNESCO, together with our partners, plan to build upon 2021's momentum and really redouble our efforts and change the world through learning to care for one another and the planet. So I think I'll stop here and back to you, David.
Rebecca, that was great. Thank you very much indeed. And really interesting to hear about what's happening outside the UK and some of the policy changes and agreements at an international level that are being made that are influencing policy in both our country and this sector. And I'll come back to you on a couple of those points in a moment, if I may. But I'm now coming to our third and final speaker in this session, Richard Sheriff, who we're delighted to have with us here today, Chief Executive now of the Red Kite Learning Trust, and also familiar to many of you as the previous President of ASCL, not just on one occasion, but on two occasions, for the first time, I'm told, since the 1930s, which is quite a record. So Richard, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
I'll try and hold back my Putin-like tendencies this afternoon, David. It's very good to see you, and thank you for letting me be involved today. I have to say, please, colleagues, and really enjoying today, but haven't I got the worst job coming at the end of some amazing speakers who've really covered the ground so intensively and has certainly inspired me. And I just want to been trying to look at all the links. I hope you can compile all those links and bits of information we can share afterwards, because I just haven't been able to keep up. But thank you to all of you for that. It's inspiring. So I'm going to go back to some very basic stuff if I can. And I am a very basic person because I'm actually a geography teacher masquerading as a CEO. As a geography teacher, the most powerful thing I've ever done is take people, young people, into the field. And my first job in working in inner city Leicester was to take kids who had never been to the countryside into the countryside. And I could listen to them talking about how messy it was and why no one clears up all those horrible twigs and leaves and doesn't tidy it up after themselves. Taking children out into the countryside and actually experience the environment beyond their own homes and cities and streets is such a powerful form of education, and one that links children to what this is all about. It's issues around biodiversity, sustainability, beauty, joy, what much the environment means to all of us and how precious our world is and its vulnerability. We can do that by getting into the classroom, but you know what? We've stopped doing it. And particularly the most vulnerable students in our communities have stopped doing it. The environment has become very much a middle class concern. I was reminded of this on Sunday morning as I rode my bike into a National Trust property. As I arrived in the property, someone dashed out and a very plummy voice told me to get off my bike. They weren't allowed inside the court, you had to park them outside in the rain. And I looked around and saw all the elderly people who had paid for their expensive membership and were wandering around the National Parks property. A National Trust property. There were no teenagers. There were no unaccompanied young people. We've made barriers also elsewhere because now people feel very vulnerable about using transport, public transport, to get out into the countryside. And the days of getting on your bike and riding into the Peak District or our local national parks have long gone because of the danger of our roads. We've trapped children, particularly ones from our vulnerable communities, within their city communities where they can't even see an environment. If you can't see it, how can you value it? If we're to engage young people, we get them in the environment, we need to get them out into the environment. And we've lost track of the importance of that. Some other reasons have made it difficult. One is cost. It's expensive to go places these days, particularly if it belongs to the National Trust, but no offence to them, there are many other things it's difficult to do. The cost of hiring a coach to get your kids out and back in a day is just horrendous, and we avoid doing it. And then we're worried about health and safety. Often it's no fault of the health and safety person, but it's us. We've become so risk averse that we avoid taking children. And we think about taking them to streams and rivers and looking at countryside and places of interest. And we think it's going to be too dangerous, we stay at home. And the threat to teachers through worrying about litigation stops them doing those things, even though as leaders, we really value them. And I know there are many who carry on doing these things. Sadly, the ones that do it are often from the most privileged backgrounds and most privileged schools. And interestingly, the independent sector continues to valiantly go to places that no state school will go in terms of their adventurous trips, visits, and appreciation of our world environment. We also know that television is no insight into the environment. I sat down last night and tried to make my wife watch Green Planet with me and David Attenborough, and she could see her desperate to go and do something more interesting. For young people these days who don't actually watch terrestrial television at all, they choose their own diet. And that diet, I doubt, includes the kind of programs that gave me the insights as a child, stuck in front of a 70s television watching Jacques Cousteau go to the bottom of the ocean and triggering me a lifelong love for the environment and interest. Our young people don't have that opportunity. So in terms of the curriculum, geography, PSHCE, all the subjects, for example, can you imagine Shakespeare and Macbeth without Burnham Wood? But if you don't have ever stood in a wood or seen the significance of landscape to our history, to our geography, to our literature, how can you really engage with that? So throughout the curriculum, we can start to get kids appreciate it, and then they will engage in the work we're doing about climate change. Then they'll understand the vulnerability of our environments, and then they'll understand why it's important we really look at the desperate and sad loss of diversity in our landscapes and our species that we're able to see around us. So I would say, in order to make the curriculum come to life, we need to engage with the environment that we talk about. As teachers who've had that privilege, the boomers who've destroyed the world for the youngsters of today, we need to prove to them there's something out there that's worth saving. And I think field work, field trips, opportunity for young people, particularly our most disadvantaged community, could be at the heart of that. I know that a national education nature park sounds like a really great idea. And, if you can free up, 2 Birmingham's worth of space to do stuff with. But when you start talking about rewilding schools, I must admit, I was caught with the idea of rewilding back to the 1970s. And did that mean re-establishing the bike sheds, smoke-filled bike sheds, and the beating up of certain children behind them at lunchtimes? That's not the kind of rewilding we really want for our schools. And actually just saying, we can't afford to take you anywhere, so we're just going to use the school grounds. Some of those school grounds, they don't have any. There's one of the schools in our trust has no grass whatsoever. It's entirely urban. They're not going to be able to contribute to that. Others, probably more privileged environments, have huge estates that they already do this already. So I'm not sure the impact. What a bigger impact would be to encourage us to use the environments that are often very short reach from us, but children never visit. The number of children I taught in Leeds who'd never been to the Yorkshire Dales, never visited it, and yet they are the gateway to this fantastic environment. So let's do that, because I think by doing that, we start to give some purpose and some reason towards this work that we do, become intellectualized, become very technical, and very difficult. And for teachers, the people that lead this, the joy of going out and simply seeing children's faces as they engage with our environment, as they stand within it, as they dip their toes into the water of it, I think will be a fantastic motivator to engage in all the other fantastic work that colleagues around here are doing. I found the NGA's work on this really helpful, Emma, and I found your 4-box matrix, as we all find, incredibly useful. And I've just focused on the curriculum in my answer today. Culture, though, is absolutely as important. Everything you've been saying today about changing the culture, about putting this right at the very top of our list of things we do, is so important. And I think through engaging the environment in a very direct way, we can start to change the culture from the bottom up and the top down in our schools. I do apologise for that. My time's up. Thank you.
Richard, that was great. And that certainly wasn't me trying to interrupt, because I really enjoyed that. And I think you gave us a very good reminder of the potential inequalities of access to environmental experiences here, which could mean that some young people have a very different experience and attitude towards environmental issues compared with others. And, like you, I recall being a constituency MP on the for one school on the Dorset-Somerset border, and being really shocked at the number of young people in that school who had never, for example, been to the coast, even though they were 11, 12, 13, 14, and the coast was sort of half an hour ago. And you could repeat similar stories in every constituency in the country, not just in urban areas, but in rural areas too. So I think that was a really useful reminder. I was just going to come to you first, actually, Richard, rather unfairly, and say, with that in mind, Are there any schools that you encountered, including when you were president, who you would regard as exemplars of helping more urban and disadvantaged communities to access the environment properly? And if so, do send us some links to them, because we might sort of put them into the summary of this discussion.
Yeah, I think there are, but I would say that they are becoming thinner on the ground. And I think during the period of COVID, I think when, you know, field work has stopped, trips and visits have stopped, I think people have become more and more risk averse, and understandably so. But prior to that even, you know, and I think what the Fieldwork Council and others would comment on this, you know, I just see a massive contrast between what I hear people doing when I speak to colleagues in the private sector, and obviously ASCL represents those members too, about what they're doing and how ambitious they are, to what's happening in the public sector. And that's a real social divide. And this is only one aspect of what we're doing here, but, you know, saying, you know, it could become very middle class terrain, saving the world. Because if you speak to our kids on Holton Moor Estate in East Leeds, you know, generally they've no idea about this and they're not interested. So the idea that every child is not correct. You know, they're disassociated. They've got to buy in at all, and they don't see it. If I speak to other children, other communities with a greener outlook, perhaps, there's a very big difference. So I think we have to think about the reach into some of those communities, and we have to try and encourage all schools to be able to engage with the environment beyond their own school gates, and be able to have the forward to and have the courage and confidence to engage children with that learning.
Rachel, thank you very much. That's a very useful reminder about the challenges there are across the world in trying to have a common societal attitude to many of the issues facing us. So we only have a few more minutes. I'm going to come back to Vibeke briefly, just to ask one question and then finish with Steve. Vibeke, this might be a slightly unfair one for you, because you're probably not allowed to be too partial between nations that are members of your organization. Given that we can be a bit parochial in all our countries, are there particularly any international exemplars in education that you've encountered, or that you could maybe refer us to after this meeting, where you've seen fantastic things going on in education and you think that it might repay us to look at experience in those countries?
Yeah, I mean, there are fantastic things going on in education all over the world, right? Now, specifically on ESD and curriculum, I mean, we actually have something called the ESD Prize in UNESCO that we hand out to schools and to organizations who are working on ESD. Education for Sustainable Development, and we've been doing this for the past 6-7 years. We just handed out 3 prizes in November during our general conference, and they went to projects as different as in Palestine, in West Africa, and in South America. And so we have a whole list of these very, very inspiring, often quite small, inspirational pilot projects, but they're certainly worthwhile looking at. And we are fortunate enough to have support from the government of Japan to also be able to continue looking for these very good practices and identify them, bring them out, and of course the purpose is really to share these good practices around the world. But there are also governments, different governments in different parts of the world who for some time have been moving on really integrating ESD and climate education into their curricula. The Italian government, for instance, has since a couple of years made ESD mandatory across in the curriculum across Italian schools. It's now part and parcel of what they call civic education. Likewise, Costa Rica just a couple of years ago launched a major sustainable development strategy that has very strong ESD components. and also you know, very strong education what do you call it, action plan. A country like Kenya, for example, has a very strong commitment and also lots of actions undertaken to mainstream ESD throughout the education system. There are really quite a number of countries to look at. And finally, maybe I can also mention a country like Germany, who since quite some years have created this national platform on ESD that really brings together high-level representatives of politics, of science, of industry, and also society, including, of course, the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research and environmental ministries and other ministries. So there are, and some of it is shared at UNESCO's as UNESCO websites and many of the webinars and meetings we are organizing. There are some good examples to look at, depending on what specifically you're looking for good examples of.
Thank you. Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. We might connect with you to see if we can get some of those examples so we can put them into the paper afterwards. Thank you very much.
You're absolutely most welcome.
Steve, you'll probably have noticed that we're pretty much out of time and I mustn't overrun too much, but I hope you won't mind me coming to you last on one sort of quite detailed but really important issue that you touched on in your comments. You talked about the need for data monitoring, but also for data monitoring that's been sort of co-designed with the sector. Are there already really good examples of this? And if not, is it something that you, with your important position and connections into FEHE, is it something that you're hoping to take further forward?
Well, it's a critical part of the strategy from the Climate Change and Sustainability Unit. They recognise it's got to be one of the 6, and I think they're right. I think the danger is it's got to meet the needs of all of the constituents on the panel and all of the people involved today. So many times, haven't we? We've had imposed, solutions from above that haven't bothered to really ask the questions about what do we really need and how can we use it, and have we got the expertise and the resources to do it without it being another burden on us in terms of bureaucracy. So but my appeal is, I think they're absolutely right to do it, and Jonathan and the team are doing a great job. I'd agree with the panel. I'd broaden it to say I think the whole strategy is a good one, but it's the fine detail really. And I think 4 or 5 of the panel said we need investment. Well, we certainly need it on this tool, David, but we need it to be co-constructed with us. We need school leaders involved in those discussions. We need FE leaders involved in those discussions. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all that's going to be useful for the primary, the secondary, FE and HE. So it's probably going to need 4 tools. But we've certainly got the capabilities to do it. And if the investment was made up front and it was co-designed with us, I think it could be a really useful tool. Because how do you know how you're performing if you don't know what your baseline is? How do you set meaningful targets? I mean, I say to our sector, it's all right setting targets for 2030, but you know where you are in 2022. And actually, those colleges that do actually realized last year in the pandemic, their carbon footprints went up in 99% of the cases because we were heating buildings, and the inefficiencies of having people working from home in heating all of those as opposed to being collectively in institutions. So I think data and data monitoring and data usage are critical, and that will drive really good behaviours. I hope that was succinct enough.
Steve, that was perfect. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're sadly out of time on what's a very extensive subject with a lot of detail in it. I'm really grateful to all those people who've listened in today. We've had some great contributions in the chat, which we will follow up on, and various links that people have provided to documents that will be interesting to follow up on. I'd like to thank Apple for supporting the event, and particularly to our guest speakers who've been with us here today and who have been both very concise and also very, very helpful, detailed and constructive in the contributions that they've made. And there was enough meat there to provide a lot of meals for a long time to come. So it's been a difficult one to chair because you've given me so many interesting things to get my teeth into. thank you very much for that. We will be following up on today's discussion with a paper covering some of the issues that we've discussed, and we will reflect on what some of the key areas are that EPI can play a role in taking forward with those of you who are interested in this agenda, and those of you across the school and colleges estate. So thank you very much indeed for your time today, and do look out for that summary paper as soon as we're able to complete it, and hopefully future events on this subject. Thank you all very much indeed.